All right, strap in everyone because today we're going deep and it's a dark one.
Oh, yeah, definitely a tough one today.
We're talking about Todd Kohlhepp. Seems like a regular, successful realtor, right?
Seems like it, yeah.
But the truth, well, the truth is way more sinister. Kohlhepp was a serial killer.
Yeah, and what makes this case so disturbing is how he was able to hide in plain sight. Really makes you think, how well can you ever really know someone?
Exactly. It's like a real-life nightmare. You think you have someone all figured out, and then boom, everything you thought you knew shatters.
It's a classic case of deception. It really highlights how important it is to pay attention to those subtle signs, the red flags that we often dismiss or overlook.
So let's rewind, go back to the beginning. Kohlhepp's early life. There were some pretty troubling signs, even as a kid. Aggression, cruelty to animals.
Right, and there was this preoccupation with sexual content that was pretty disturbing, especially at such a young age. I mean, these behaviors are definitely concerning, especially in hindsight.
And looking back, it's like trying to piece together a puzzle. Searching for those early warning signs that might have hinted at the darkness to come.
It's kind of like those crime shows where they profile the killer, you try to connect the dots, but it's not always clear until it's too late.
Yeah, and in Kohlhepp's case, the signs were there even before he became a teenager. Then when he was just 15, he committed a horrific act.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about that. It was brutal. He kidnapped and raped a 14-year-old girl. A terrible, terrible crime.
Absolutely. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for that. And during his psychological evaluations, he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and it was noted that he had an above-average IQ.
That's a dangerous combination. Borderline personality disorder can make people impulsive, emotionally unstable. They often struggle with relationships.
Right.
And then you add a high IQ to the mix. Well, those individuals can be incredibly manipulative and cunning.
Like a wolf in sheep's clothing, they can blend in, fly under the radar, and even use their intelligence to deceive and manipulate others.
Precisely. It's a chilling thought.
And what's even more disturbing is that the judge who sentenced Kohlhepp said that he was behaviorally and emotionally dangerous and that he might not be rehabilitated.
Wow, that's a strong statement from a judge. It really highlights the severity of his condition and the potential risks he posed even back then. It makes you wonder, were there any missed opportunities to intervene, to help him during his time in prison?
That's the question, isn't it? Did the system fail to address the root causes of his dangerous behavior? Did they do enough to try and rehabilitate him?
It's really tough to say for sure. Rehabilitation is such a complex process, and it's not always successful.
No, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution. But after serving 14 years, Kohlhepp was released, and he moved to South Carolina for a fresh start.
You'd think with a criminal record like his, it would be tough to rebuild his life, to reintegrate into society.
You would think so, right? But that wasn't the case at all. Kohlhepp somehow managed to build a successful career as a realtor.
A realtor, seriously. It's mind-boggling how he was able to pull that off.
It really is. He managed to get a real estate license, despite being a registered sex offender. And he was good at it, too. He was selling houses, making a living, all while hiding this incredibly dark past.
It really makes you question the system, How could someone with his history be allowed to hold such a position of trust?
Right. I mean, think about it. He's interacting with people, often in their homes, and no one has a clue about his true nature.
It's a perfect example of how someone can present this facade of normalcy while hiding a dark and dangerous side.
Exactly. He was living a double life. Outwardly, he seemed like an average guy. He got a pilot's license, bought properties, lived what appeared to be a pretty normal life.
But underneath all that, there were these cracks in the facade starting to show. There are accounts from people who knew him, who worked with him, and they started noticing some pretty disturbing things about him.
Like what kind of things?
Well, for one, he had this obsession with firearms. It was more than just a hobby. It was almost like a fixation. And then there were these inappropriate comments, these off-color jokes that made people feel uneasy.
It's like those subtle red flags, the ones that people often brush off as just quirks. But in hindsight, they become these glaring warning signs.
Exactly. And it's not always easy to recognize them in the moment, especially when someone is actively trying to conceal their true intentions.
It's like trying to read between the lines to see beyond the mask that someone is presenting to the world.
It's a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the people we think we know the best are the ones we should be most wary of. It's scary to think about, isn't it? How someone would be so good at hiding who they really are. But as we dig deeper into Kohlhepp's story, well, it gets even harder to ignore the warning signs.
Yeah, this is where things take a really dark turn. It's 2003, 13 years after Kohlhepp gets out of prison. And this is when the Superbike Motorsports murders happen in Chesnee, South Carolina. A truly horrific crime. and one that really shook the community.
Oh, absolutely. This is where Kohlhepp's true nature starts to reveal itself, I think. The crime scene was just brutal. 4 people shot and killed right inside the motorcycle shop. And the police, they were baffled for years. It shows how calculated Kohlhepp was. I mean, to commit such a horrific crime and then just disappear. It's unsettling, to say the least.
Yeah, the victims were Scott Ponder, the shop owner, Brian Lucas, the service manager, Chris Sherbert, a mechanic, and Beverly Guy, who was the bookkeeper. She was also Ponder's mother. All 4 of them shot multiple times. It was a bloodbath. And the case went unsolved for over a decade. Can you imagine the pain the families went through, the constant wondering, the lack of answers?
It's heartbreaking to be left with so many unanswered questions, not knowing who or why. It's just devastating. For 13 years, they had no closure, no justice, and all that time, Kohlhepp was out there living his life, carrying this awful secret.
It just boggles the mind. And to think that he was able to separate those actions from his everyday life, to just not compartmentalize it like that.
Well, it's a common trait in serial killers, unfortunately. They're able to maintain a sense of normalcy while engaging in truly horrific acts. It's a disturbing paradox, and that's what makes them both so fascinating and so terrifying.
It's a stark reminder that evil can lurk beneath the surface, even in those who seem the most ordinary. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. In 2016, a couple, Kayla Brown and her boyfriend, Charles David Carver, vanished. And this would be what finally led to Kohlhepp's downfall.
This is when we really start to see the extent of Kohlhepp's depravity. I mean, to find Kayla Brown chained up in a metal container on his property is just horrifying, a truly horrific scene that will stay with anyone who followed this case. But it also shows her strength, her resilience.
It's true. Her story is a testament to the human spirit. Imagine witnessing your boyfriend being murdered and then having to endure months of captivity. It's a nightmare scenario. But she survived.
She did, and her strength is remarkable. It shows us that even in the darkest of places, there can be hope, there can be survival. But sadly, the horrors that were uncovered on Kohlhepp's property didn't stop with Kayla's rescue.
No, unfortunately, there were more victims. Investigators found more bodies on his property, buried there.
Yeah, and they were identified as Johnny Joe Coxey and Megan Lee McCraw Coxey, a young couple who had been missing for almost a year. And get this, Kohlhepp had hired them to work on his property, and then he killed them. It's just chilling, so premeditated, so cold-hearted.
It really shows a complete lack of empathy, a total disregard for human life. It's disturbing to think that someone like that could walk among us. So with Kayla's rescue and the discovery of these other victims, the investigation really intensified, and finally Kohlhepp started to confess.
It was a crucial moment in the case. I mean, his confessions brought answers to crimes that had haunted the community for years, but it also showed how calculated and callous he truly was.
He admitted to the Superbike Motorsports murders, gave details that had never been released to the public, confirming he was the one responsible for those killings after all those years. And he confessed to killing the Coxeys, too. But here's the thing.
His confessions weren't out of some sense of remorse, right?
Exactly. It wasn't about making things right. He made a deal. He wanted to talk to his mother, give her a photo, and even transfer money to a friend's child's college fund, all in exchange for admitting to his crimes.
Wow, it sounds like he was bargaining. He had no real remorse for what he did.
Not at all. It's like he was totally detached from the impact of his actions. But it gets even crazier. Kohlhepp claimed that there were more victims, more bodies out there.
And that sent shockwaves through the community, of course. Investigators started looking into unsolved cases, trying to see if Kohlhepp could be connected to any of them.
Yeah, it was like opening a Pandora's box. No one knew what they might find. But then there's another detail about Kohlhepp that I find particularly chilling. Remember he was a realtor? Well, investigators found all these online reviews they think he wrote.
And they weren't just your average reviews, were they?
Nope. They were full of dark humor and disturbing references, almost like he was hinting at his crimes.
Like he was leaving clues, taunting investigators maybe. It's definitely creepy. It makes you wonder about his motives, about his mental state. Was he trying to get attention? Was it some sick game to him?
It's hard to say, but those reviews add a whole other layer of creepiness to this case. And they remind us that evil can hide in plain sight. Online, too.
Yeah, that's a good point. The digital world can be just as dangerous as the real world. But let's not forget the victims in all of this. Their families are left with this unimaginable loss, knowing their loved one were taken from them in such a brutal and senseless way. Their lives are changed forever.
It's a tragedy that impacts not only the victims and their families, but the entire community. And it raises important questions about how we can prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again. How can we protect people? How can we help those who have been affected by such terrible events?
These are really tough questions with no easy answers. But by looking at cases like this, by trying to understand what drives to people like Kohlhepp and the warning signs they might exhibit, maybe we can start to find ways to prevent similar tragedies from happening again.
It really makes you think about the people around you, doesn't it? You never know what someone might be hiding. But amidst all this darkness, it's important to remember the incredible strength of the survivors, especially Kayla Brown.
Absolutely, she's a true inspiration. To go through something so horrific and still find the will to survive, it's remarkable. And her bravery in testifying against Kohlhepp was crucial in bringing him to justice.
Speaking of justice, Kohlhepp faced a whole slew of charges, obviously. Murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, the whole 9 yards. And given the severity of his crimes, the prosecution was pushing for the death penalty.
And understandably so, the evidence was overwhelming. His confessions, the bodies on his property, Kalla's testimony, it all pointed to his guilt.
Right. But in the end, Kohlhepp took a plea deal. He agreed to confess to all 7 murders in exchange for life in prison. It was a controversial decision, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. There was a lot of debate about it. Some people felt like he deserved the death penalty, that anything less wouldn't be true justice for the victims and their families.
It's a complex issue for sure. I mean, does the death penalty really bring closure? Or is it just perpetuating the cycle of violence? These are the kinds of questions that society grapples with. There are no easy answers.
No, there really are. But in May 2017, Kohlhepp was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. So he's going to spend the rest of his days behind bars.
And I think the judge in the case really summed it up when he called Kohlhepp's actions cold, calculated, and depraved. A pretty accurate description, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. No other way to put it. But while the sentence might bring some sense of closure, I don't think anything can truly erase the pain and trauma that Kohlhepp inflicted on the victims and their families. They'll be dealing with the consequences of his actions for the rest of their lives.
It's a tragedy that will forever leave its mark. And even with Kohlhepp locked away, there's still so many unanswered questions, especially about those claims he made about having more victims.
Yeah, that's something that still haunts a lot of people. Investigators haven't found any evidence to support his claims, but they also haven't been able to completely rule them out. So it's this lingering uncertainty that's hard to shake.
It's like a ghost story that never really ends. And it makes you realize that even with Kohlhepp behind bars, the full story might never be known.
It's true. There might be families out there who will never have answers. And it just adds another layer of tragedy to this already horrific case.
It really does. And it brings up a question that I think we need to ask ourselves after cases like this. How do we prevent something like this from happening again?
Right. It's a question that weighs heavily on all of us. I think the first step is awareness. Recognizing the warning signs, the subtle clues that someone might be struggling or that they might be capable of violence.
Yeah, and it's not about being paranoid or suspicious of everyone. It's about being informed and being aware of the potential dangers that exist.
Exactly. We need to educate ourselves about mental health issues, about the signs of potential violence, about manipulative behavior. We can't just ignore red flags or dismiss them as personality quirks.
Sometimes those little things, those seemingly insignificant behaviors, can actually be cries for help, or worse, indicators that something truly terrible is about to happen.
And it's not just about recognizing the signs in others, it's about creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up. If you see something that concerns you, say something. Don't be afraid to report it. You could be saving someone's life.
Absolutely. It's about looking out for each other, about creating a community where everyone feels safe and supported. And we also need to make sure that people have access to mental health resources.
Definitely. Early intervention is so important. We need to make it easier for people to get the help they need before things spiral out of control.
The case of Todd Kohlhepp is a chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. It can wear a mask of normalcy and blend in with the crowd. It forces us to confront the darker side of human nature, the potential for violence and deception that exists within us all.
But it also shows the resilience of the human spirit, the courage of survivors like Kayla Brown, and the dedication of those who work tirelessly to seek justice and to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
It's a story that reminds us to be vigilant, to be aware, to speak up, and to never stop fighting for a safer and more compassionate world.
Well said. We have to learn from cases like this. We have to use them in opportunities to grow, to learn, and to create a better future for everyone.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dark and disturbing world of Todd Kohlhepp. It's not an easy story to hear, but it's an important one. Stay safe out there, everyone.